Okay. All right. All right. And here we go. Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hi, Facebook friends. Sherry Story here. And as you know, I'm a school board member and I represent the Chuckatuck Borough. And I'm about to start a little series of interviews from some of the people that are in my borough. And I'll call it Story Talks. And then today, I've invited one of my guests, John Newhard. He lives in the Chuckatuck Borough. And I've asked him to come and talk about and have a conversation with me about FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. So this is a federal and a state law that I personally think is very important for open government, for free and open government, so citizens know what their elected officials are doing. So I've invited Mr. Newhard. He's an attorney, and let me introduce him to you. Mr. Newhard is a retired attorney who's lived in Suffolk since 2001. Mr. Newhard lives in my borough, and from 1992 to 2003, he was the deputy city attorney for the city of Virginia, where he was the attorney for the Virginia School Board. And he managed the legal business for their school board and for school administration. From 1971 to 1992, he was a partner with the firm of Breeden, Howard, and McMillan in Norfolk. From 1968 to 1971, he was a JAG officer and military judge in the Marine Corps. Thank you very much, Mr. Newhard, for joining me today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So first of all, can you just share with me, what do you see as the real goals for this law, Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA as we call it?
Well, with respect to the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, which is the one I'm familiar with from working with the school board of the city of Virginia Beach, the purpose is transparency in government. Elected officials who make policy should be public about their decisions. The reasons the decisions are made, the process they go through when they make them, and the finances of the government, which, after all, are funded by taxation of citizens. And in a democracy, which is what we have, this allows citizens to interact with their representatives, evaluate their performance, before electing them again. It also affords oversight in the event of mismanagement or misconduct. And this takes place by observing meetings and reading written records. And that's what the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, is all about. I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said that the key to democracy is a knowledgeable electorate. And in order to have a knowledgeable electorate, they have to know what is going on in their government. So somebody, many years after the Declaration of Independence and the adoption of the Constitution, came up with the Freedom of Information Act as a method of providing for transparency in government and educating citizens as to what is going on within the government.
I agree, and I think transparency is a good word overall for this law. It was something that I ran on. It was one of my core principles when I decided to run. I felt even, I know for the school board as a teacher, I felt I didn't know enough of what my own board was doing. And so that was one of the reasons that I went ahead and ran for this office, was on transparency. And it's been a year plus a few months, and I've learned a lot about the FOIA law, read it a lot because I realized that this was my friend and a tool for open government. I know that it says it is intended to be applied liberally. Can you expound a little bit what that means that the law was intended to be applied liberally.
Well, yes. And it actually, the act itself provides that there's a presumption. In other words, presumptively, that one should favor disclosure and openness in government transactions over non-disclosure and closed meetings. And I think that's the best way to understand what's meant by it should be liberally construed. That is that when there's a question of whether or not something should be disclosed, the presumption is that it should be disclosed. There's not a presumption that information should not be disclosed. Now, there are exemptions within the Freedom of Information Act, but even the exemptions, they're not requirements. In other words, if there's an exemption for personnel matters, if you're evaluating the superintendent, or if you're disciplining an employee, there's no requirement that that information not be disclosed. It just allows you not to disclose it.
Okay.
And there may be a good reason for that. But there are no requirements in the Freedom of Information Act that information not be disclosed. There are just certain areas in which you're permitted to be exempt from disclosing. That doesn't mean you have to. That doesn't mean you cannot disclose it.
That's pretty interesting. I think to sort of wrap my head around that, to realize that there's no requirements to go into a closed meeting or to not disclose something, but there's a few areas where you're permitted to do it if you feel that there is some good reason to do it.
That's right, and that's exactly correct. Now, of course, it's up to the body to decide whether to use the exemption. In other words, I don't know how many people there are on the Suffolk City School Board. What is it, 9?
There's seven.
Okay. If 4 people want to go into a closed meeting, they're permitted to do so if they vote to do so, and if what they're going into a closed meeting for, there's an exception which allows that, but they're not required to do that. But 4 people.
As a former Virginia Beach school system attorney, were there parts of FOIA that seemed to receive more attention than others? So maybe we would say they're especially important. You felt that you gave advice on more often than other parts?
Yes. Basically, the Freedom of Information Act covers 2 things. One is disclosure of documents. In other words, you have a right to request documents which show government proceedings and government records. And the other is having closed meetings from which the public or the press is excluded. And generally, my experience was that the closed meetings received more attention than requests for documents. Because if there were requests for documents, you usually had someone that was in charge of responding to those requests, and usually you would seek the opinion of the attorney representing the school board if there was some question about that. The closed meetings, a lot of people had misconceptions about that, and the biggest one they had misconceptions about was the legal advice. In other words, they would think that just because you wanted to ask the school board lawyer a question, you could go into closed session to do that. And that really is not the case. If you wanted to ask an attorney if an action was lawful, you generally would not be able to go into closed session for that, as opposed to whether or not a lawsuit should be settled, or whether or not the lawsuit had merits, or whether or not the school system's position on the matter had merits. And the reason that the latter is the proper subject for a closed session is because you would prejudice the position of the school board or the school system if you were asking the attorney whether or not a case had merits, because if he felt it didn't have merits, you don't want to tell the other side that.
Right, sure. Well, that makes sense. And I remember that exception.
So many times people would want to go into closed session because something might be embarrassing. Someone had made a mistake, or someone had not acted properly, or would be criticized because something would become known. Well, that's not an exception to the Freedom of Information Act. If you're a public official in a public body, I mean, people are entitled to criticize, and they're entitled to know if you've made errors or mistakes. The mere fact that you've made an error or mistake and it would be embarrassing to you for the public to learn about that through the press, that doesn't justify a closed meeting. You have to have something specific. Now, there are reasons. If you're going to hire a new superintendent, for example, usually what happens is you go out and solicit people to submit their resumes.
Right.
And when they're submitting their resumes, they're probably not going to submit a resume if they know the school board they're working for learns that they're inquiring about a job in another system.
Right.
So there's an exception for that.
Okay.
If the school system is going to purchase a piece of property and you're negotiating with someone over the price, you can discuss that in closed session, because the school system is entitled to negotiate a price without other people that may want to sell their property
That makes sense.
knowing what the school system is willing to pay for something. Now, once the property has been purchased, the reason for that exception disappears, and people are entitled to know what you paid for the property, so that they can judge whether or not the action was reasonable. And the same thing would apply with the hire of a superintendent. Once the superintendent is hired, the public's entitled to know the terms of his contract. They're entitled to know how much he's being paid, because the reason for the exemption no longer applies.
Right. Another question: how seriously should governments, governing bodies, take FOIA, and how seriously do the courts take FOIA violations? Did you?
There are a couple of reasons why a public body should take the Freedom of Information Act seriously. One is, if you believe in democracy and open government, you should be willing for the public to know what it is that you're doing.
Sure.
So that's one reason. Another is that in terms of a court, if you violate the Freedom of Information Act, first of all, the newspapers and media are very familiar with the Freedom of Information Act.
Okay.
Because they are the fifth estate. They're the group that tries to publicize and educate the public on what's actually going on in these meetings. So they're very knowledgeable about it. And if you make a mistake and try and withhold documents that are entitled to be seen, they're going to take action on it. They'll go into court and seek an injunction. And an injunction is an order by the court that you disclose something. And that happens all of the time. You'll notice if you read the Virginian Pilot, that newspaper goes into court frequently
Yes.
when they seek information and it's denied by a public body. And another reason is that they're not only can a court issue an injunction, a court can levy a fine against individuals that violate the Freedom of Information Act. So those are the reasons that you should pay attention to it and be careful about going into closed session. Now, normally what happens is the school board attorney will tell you if you're violating the Freedom of Information Act. When I represented the school board of the city of Virginia Beach, we were having a school board meeting and all of a sudden something appeared on an agenda that said they were going to go into closed session to discuss something. I would call up whoever was proposing that agenda and I'd say, tell me about this. Tell me what it is that you wish to discuss in closed session. They had not talked with me about it in advance. And once you get into closed session, normally your school attorney would tell you, they'd say, wait a minute, the topic you went in here for was this. And now you're discussing this. And you're not entitled to do that.
Okay.
You're going to have to go back out into public session and discuss it in public session, or if the topic that you're talking about was not listed when you went in, you're going to have to go back and start again and list this topic, which you did not really list. And a good school board attorney will tell you that.
Great. Thank you. While you were attorney, did the Virginia Beach School District, did they use closed session very often? I mean, was it a regular part of their meeting or was it applied less often?
No, it was not a routine. It was not a routine.
It was not routine.
It was not a routine topic on each school board agenda.
Gotcha.
But that was a very large school system. When I was there, they had 85 schools, and their operating budget was over $500,000 a year. So they had a lot of business to transact, and they would go into closed session, but they certainly didn't have a closed session at every meeting.
Okay, it wasn't regular. All right, thank you. How important, I find, I admit as a citizen, I'm not sure I realized that the availability for a typical citizen to use FOIA to understand what their government is doing. And now, of course, I see the value of it. And I'm wondering if you could just share for those who are listening, teachers that live in Suffolk or whatever city they live in, how important is it that they understand this law and use it?
Well, not just teachers, but citizens in general.
Okay.
First of all, you should know that you're entitled to make a request for documents. And that's called a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request. And you have to do it in writing. And all you have to do is just write a letter, or could be an email. I guess, I don't know whether the Suffolk School Board or the school system has one person designated to receive FOIA requests.
They do. They do.
Who's that? The clerk?
The clerk can receive them, or the person who's the head of our PR department receives it.
What you would do if you wanted to see a particular contract, you would sit down and you would, the city of Suffolk approves the use of emails for this, and they have a.
And we do as well.
Yeah. Okay. So what you would do is you would do an email, and you'd address it to the clerk of the school board, and you'd date it, and you would say that you're a citizen of Virginia. You have to be a citizen of Virginia to use the name, and that you request a copy of the following document, and you would describe what the document is, and the governmental body is entitled to charge you the cost of producing that document.
Okay.
Start asking for things that have to be researched or are lengthy, they're entitled to charge you a reasonable cost. So you would say, dear whoever the clerk is, I'm a citizen of the state of Virginia. I live at such and such an address. And under the Freedom of Information Act, and I would always say that, I request a copy of the contract of employment of the superintendent, or any amendments thereto. Or I would request a copy of the minutes of the school board meeting of a certain date. Or I would request a copy of the contract between the school board and the Pepsi-Cola distributor. Or a copy of the contract between the Pepsi-Cola distributor and school board or a particular school. And the public body is required to respond in writing to that request, and they are required to respond within 5 days. They may not be able to produce the document within 5 days, but within 5 days, they're supposed to respond and say, I will make the document available. I won't make the document available because it's subject to such and such exemption, or it will take us a week to get it, so we will produce it to you in another 5 days.
Okay.
But you're entitled to a written response, and that is how you generally go about obtaining information from a public body, whether it be the city of Suffolk, the Suffolk School Board, or the Suffolk School System. And that's what you do. You sign your name and tell them where you want it sent, and if you're doing it by email, I usually say an email response is sufficient for my purposes.
Right. And you mentioned contracts. So all contracts that we have with whomever we deal business, whether it's a contract with, well, any contract, those contracts, once they've been signed, are they all open for viewing?
I would think so. I can't think of one that wouldn't be.
Okay.
Now, the school board may try, the vendor may try and get the school board to put a clause in the contract saying that it won't be disclosed because it would hurt the vendor's proprietary information. But I'm not sure that they're entitled to do that.
Okay. All right. That's good. This has been a great conversation. Every time whether I attend a workshop on it or I talk with someone, I realize that having the freedom to get information, to keep government as transparent as possible, to do all business in the open, I think that holds all of us as elected officials accountable, but it also just guarantees that we're in a democracy and that there's just doesn't seem to be a lot of reasons, except for the few exceptions that you talked about, that we wouldn't want the citizens to know about what we're doing and the decisions we're making, how much it costs. And I think that's very important and can really help make any body, whether it's a city, a school board, the state, it just helps them govern better by being accountable to those people who elected them.
Right, and what you do is you make a request, and if they claim there's an exemption, they have to specify the exemption.
Right.
And there are numerous exemptions.
I've seen that.
When it comes to document requests, the General Assembly makes all sorts of exemptions based on a request from their constituents. And if they put an exemption in the law, then that's exempt. But people should be very mindful of that also, because
Right.
there shouldn't be as many exemptions as there are, frankly.
Right. I understand that. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
No,
All right.
I think it's an important piece of legislation. And who was it? I think Benjamin Franklin, who was very old at the time the Constitution was adopted. What was it? I believe it was Benjamin Franklin that said, "We've given you a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Be interesting to see if you can keep it."
Yes. I agree. I think that was a pretty wise statement at that time, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it really was. Thank you so much
My pleasure.
for doing this. And I appreciate you talking and having this conversation with me.
Well, I appreciate your serving on the school board.
Thank you.
It's a lot of time and a lot of effort, and
Thank you so much.
It's a worthwhile thing to do.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too.